Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and welcome. Signore e signori, ospiti illustri, buon pomeriggio e benvenuti. Please take your seats, and the people who are finishing lunch, I hope they'll come in to join us for this final plenary session at the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction, where we'll be addressing resilience in a changing climate. And it's encouraging to see actually so many of you still here in the hall on a Friday afternoon. Thank you for staying. I'd also like to send a warm welcome to those of you watching on the internet. Thank you for joining us. So, for those of you who were not in the plenary session that I chaired yesterday, my name is Aminda Leigh. I'm a journalist and broadcaster, British, and from this week also Italian too. I swore my oath of citizenship. I started my career... Thank you very much. I'm very pleased. So I started my career at the BBC before coming to live and work out of Rome. And I specialize in environmental topics, in particular climate change. And I'm honored to be moderating this discussion this afternoon, which I think is most important. Interpretation, just a reminder, is available in English and Channel 2, Italian Channel 1, French Channel 3, and Russian Channel 4. And of course, we also have Italian Sign Language as well. I'm going to return to the topic of this session in a moment and explain how the next 90 minutes are going to run. But first, a few practical issues. I don't want any disasters happening in this session, so let's reduce the risk. Please keep your telephones on silent, but feel free to tweet away. The hashtag is EFDRR 2018, and it's a good way to spread information from this session out of this room. We will be running Pigeonhole as well, so you can ask your questions. For those of you who can't remember how it works, very simple, www.pigeonhole.at. Thank you, and then enter the passcode EFDRR. So nice and simple. And you can send in your questions, and you can also vote for the questions that you see coming in. So how this plenary session is going to work. Excuse me, it's very hot under these lights today. So, how's it going to work? Well, we're going to have a keynote speech from Diana Reckien, who's one of the authors of the recently published report on global warming of 1.5 degrees C. After her speech, we're going to have a few minutes of questions, so you can put your questions to her. And then we're going to go to a panel debate with 5 speakers who will be giving us different perspectives and experiences, and they'll be sharing them with us. You'll also have the opportunity to ask them questions too. And we'll also have microphones in the audience, so if you want to pose your question in person by voice, you can do that. Even though I have only lived in Rome for 20 years, I personally have already seen its climate change in its quite a short space of time. There are now more heat waves, more floods, more droughts. We're seeing forest fires. There's no doubt that the climate is changing. I imagine you've all, of course, heard about the terrible storms in Italy at the end of October, when more than 30 people died. There was extensive damage to infrastructure, and 14 million trees were blown down. Just 14 million trees Italy lost. And these are just examples from Italy. Many other European countries have been affected by extreme weather events, fatal flooding in recent weeks and months. But what can we expect when the world becomes 1.5 degrees warmer? I hope no warmer than it already is over here. And what about if it becomes 2 degrees warmer? How can we prepare and boost our resilience to these new climate conditions? Well, first what we need to know what we should plan for, what's going to happen. And to tell us a bit more about what lies ahead for us in our future, we have Diana Reckien. She's our keynote speaker. She's an associate professor of climate change and urban equalities at the Faculty of Geoinformation Science and Earth Observation at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. She is a specialist in the interface between climate change and urban research. And today she's going to be presenting some of the key findings in the recent report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees. Before I give the floor to Diana, I want to ask the audience, how many of you have heard of this report? Hands up. Okay, a lot of people in the room have heard of this report. That's excellent. Now I'm going to do the big question. How many people in this room have read the report? Okay, a few brave souls out there. For the rest of you, Diana is going to save you from having to read more than 800 pages to find out more. She's going to be picking out some of the salient points, particularly connected to resilience and a focus on implications for Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Diana Reckien.
Yes, it's on. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Aminda, for the very nice introduction. Yes, my name is Diana Reckien. I'm working for more than 15 years in climate change science nowadays. Now at the University of Twente, before that at Columbia University in the US, and also at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, if that's a name for some of the people in the room. Together with my co-author of that presentation, I am also part of the next assessment report of the IPCC, so the 6th assessment report, the work which has just started this year. So let's move into some of the implications of the 1.5 degree report. This also remains as a summary. As Aminda said, it's quite extensive. So the report in numbers first. 91 authors from 40 countries, 133 contributing authors, 6,000 studies considered, 1,113 reviewers, and more than 42,000 comments that had to be answered. Each single comment had to be responded to. The final report has about 780 pages, and a summary for policymakers still 33. So it is, although it's just a special report, a very extensive piece of work. It was actually demanded and therefore an outcome of the Paris Agreement, because in the Paris Agreement, as hopefully most people in the room know, we used the numbers 2 degrees Celsius versus 1.5 degrees or lower than 2 degrees. And it was the task of the IPCC to inform that process, that UNFCCC process, with substantial scientific knowledge, what that means. So it started with 3 questions. What does 1.5 degree mean? Versus 2. Why are we considering that? So what are the impacts? Does it matter? And how, if it matters, can we achieve 1.5 or 2 degrees? So the main question really was 1.5 versus 2 degrees. I won't say much about more than 2 degrees here. Yeah, a little bit though. So let's say the main outcomes, really the 3 main bullet points are: human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of warming today. The temperature increased by 0.87 degrees Celsius. The remaining to the 1 degree was taken up, for instance, by the oceans. Yeah, so there are also things, there's a temperature uptake of the oceans. And then global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degree between 2030 and 2052. There is a little bit, as you see, uncertainty in that if we continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions at the current rate. So this is soon. That was the question why. Now we're coming to, that was the question what, now we're coming to the question why. So why does it matter? Should we care? And there we find future climate-related risks depend on the rate, peak, and duration of warming. But there have been found substantial changes on the regional scale between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And I will tell you how. Particularly large differences are found for temperature extremes. For instance, here, extreme hot days, in particular in the mid-latitudes, are higher than the 1.5 or 2 degrees average global temperature. So if we talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius increase at the global average, we will speak about approximately 3 degree increase on land. The same if we have 2 degree on average globally, then we have 4 degree increase on land. And this is, let me tell you, for the climate system, substantial, really, really large. Then extreme cold nights, when you look at the bottom of the maps here, there are particularly pronounced for the higher latitudes. So there we see a large increase, particularly at the poles. Number of hot days here are compared to pre-industrial, mostly increasing in the tropics. But when you look at the very right-hand map, there you see that the difference between 1.5 degree and 2 degrees is mostly pronounced in the mid-latitudes. So for, mid of Europe, for instance, as well. More, why should we care? Precipitation changes are a bit more diverse and not as certain as the temperature increases, but you still see very significant patterns. You see that in the mid-latitudes, north and south of the poles, we will mostly see a decrease in precipitation, whereas there is an increase at the poles for mean precipitation. And when you now look at extreme precipitation, then that pattern more or less continues with more precipitation at the poles and also a little bit more in higher latitudes, but more but in particular what I just said, when you look at pre-industrial versus 1.5 or 2. Again, when you look at the difference between 1.5 and 2, then you see that there are across almost the entire globe, we have a decrease of precipitation apart from the poles. So 1.5 versus 2 degree does make a large difference. More why for other natural systems. For instance, sea level rise is approximately by 0.1 meters, so 10 centimeters different between 1.5 and 2. This would mean that approximately 10 million people are less exposed to related risks. Regarding ice in the Arctic, we will see once an ice-free Arctic at 1.5 degrees Celsius and almost once in a decade for 2 degrees. So that change is really, really dramatic, for ice cover. And coral reefs, as probably many of you know, because that's in the media, 70 to 90% will have declined at 1.5 degree and they will have almost vanished at 2 degree. The IPCC already during the last assessment cycle came up with these so-called reasons for concern. So they put up 5 systems, so to say, that are of particular concern, and these are unique and threatened systems like coral reefs, extreme weather events, the distribution of impacts across the globe, so we do have a large equity issue, global aggregate impacts, and so-called large-scale singular events, so really big disasters like the breaking up of ice shelves or so. And here the extreme weather events, which I've just shown on the previous slide, are already kind of the second most important that directly affects humans very immediately. More on human systems. Water stress would double at 2 degrees as compared to 1.5. We see 4% additional world population as of 2000 under 1.5 degrees. We will have 100% more people affected by floods and 170% more when we make it at 2 degrees. Droughts are even more serious, so we will have 350 million urban people exposed at 1.5 degrees Celsius and about 410 with, of course, uncertainty at 2 degrees, mostly in Central, South, EU, Mediterranean, West Africa, and Asia. And here again, something to the two reasons of concern. Yeah, so you read that with a color code, very like intuitively. Yellow is kind of moderate risk. Orange is high risk and purple is very high risk. And you see that, for instance, for coastal flooding, when we look at the human systems now, coastal flooding and heat-related morbidity and mortality are those where we are, where we see the strong increase. Coastal flooding in particular, we are already reaching the yellow. We're already reaching the orange part. Okay. A quick snapshot onto the Mediterranean because the conference is in Italy. Mediterraneans are regarded as a climate change hotspot as concerns heat extremes, decreases in mean precipitation, and related increases in dry spells. For instance, for 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, we see about 7% more dry spells. For up to 11%. We see 9% reduction in runoff for 1.5 and about 17% for 2 degrees. There is a risk of water deficit already for 1.5 degrees Celsius, a high risk or higher risk for 2 degrees, and actually a very high risk if we don't make that. So this will, the Mediterraneans will really have a problem with heat and related drought and dry spells. So now just a quick snapshot on mitigation. So can we still reach that? What would it mean? What would we need to do? Although when I'm coming to adaptation and resilience, I will go into more depth. But just a quick snapshot here, mitigation. Can we still reach it? First of all, there is no single 1.5 degree warmer world. This is because we can reach 1.5 via different ways. We can just slowly approach 1.5. Yeah? We can overshoot, meaning first reaching 2 degrees or even 2.5, then take a lot of CO2 out of the air and the system again, and then go down to 1.5 again. Yeah? Or we can just cross 1.5, or we can stabilize there. So this, of course, are all differences of how you can look at the system. When you look at observed global temperature, then you see past temperature change here, yeah, and then you see scenarios, so to say, on the right-hand side. And these are the three, let's say, most iconic scenarios that were tested. So kind of an overshoot scenario that stays on over 1.5 degree, one that comes down again, and one maybe in which we are slowly approaching 1.5. And all this has different implications for the energy system. For instance, when we meet all the current ambitions under the Paris Agreement, this would lead to approximately 3 degrees Celsius If we do not even meet those, we are at least at 4 degrees. Limiting warming would mean that we reach net zero CO2 emissions globally around 2050. And we have to have deep cuts in non-CO2 forces that is mostly methane. Yeah? And then you can see, like down here, if we follow the blue path, then we would, on top here, probably follow the blue shaded path. If we go here, gray, then we are in the middle scenario. And if we are not able to reduce methane by a great deal, then we are actually likely surpassing 1.5. Very important for reaching 1.5 degree are the next years until 2030. We need 40 to 50% reduction from 2010 levels until 2030. Otherwise, we cannot make it anymore. So it is really, really important that we try to think hard now, what can we change? And almost all scenarios demand carbon dioxide removal. So almost all, actually I think all, scenarios need that carbon dioxide is taken out of the air again at a later point in order to make it to 1.5 degrees. This, of course, also has a lot of implications, like how this is translated into sectors, and just a few. There is much more in the report: lower energy use, enhanced energy efficiency, faster electrification, renewables to supply 70 to 85% of electricity in 2050. We need to have around 0% of coal in electricity in 2050. We need to use land for energy crops and forests, and also a lot of governance implications attached, which are really drawn out in the report much more detail. For instance, large and intensive international cooperations for upscaling and for bringing technology into areas that have no capabilities to help themselves. So now to adaptation and resilience. Risk would be reduced by upscaling and acceleration of far-reaching multi-level and cross-sectoral climate mitigation, and both incremental and transformational adaptation. Most adaptation needs are lower at 1.5 degrees, and there are adaptation options available. For instance, related to water stress, it is mentioned that sustainable water management can help, for instance, via wastewater recycling, stormwater diversion, that urban design needs to mediate runoff, encourage groundwater recharge, enhance water quality. And there is a large, so to say, untapped potential in behavioral shifts, that at least what the report finds, towards using irrigation technologies that change behavior, as opposed to large dams with high financial, ecological, and social costs. But there are also limits to adaptation and adaptive capacity for some human and natural systems, and that even at 1.5 degrees. Mostly seen with regard to ecosystems and human health. For a lot of human systems, infrastructure systems, we actually need transformational adaptation. Okay, thank you. In particular, long-lived urban transportation, water and energy systems that will be constructed in the next 30 years need to be different from those in the 20th century if they should serve the transformation. So we are talking about transformational adaptation. But as a positive note, the literature does identify energy infrastructure, appliances, urban planning, transport, and other things that can facilitate that systemic change. As I said, partnership is vitally needed. Without, we cannot make it. That's very clear, because we need it for upscaling and for helping very vulnerable regions. And as a summary here, I want to come back to how this is related to the SDGs, and also give you my main outcomes of the talk. Is it important whether 1.5 or 2? Yes, it is. The risk is substantially lower at 1.5, sometimes as a factor of 2. Yeah? Some impacts double for 2 degrees than compared to 1.5. Can we still make it? Yes, we can still make it. If we don't do anything, the risks are lower than 5%, but stabilizing at 1.5 requires upscaling and acceleration of far-reaching multi-level and cross-sectoral mitigation and incremental and sometimes transformational adaptation, but we can make it. And how can we make it? And there are some summary points here. Like immediate actions are necessary, but I also want to point out that this graph here actually shows that the SDGs here, that's for the SDGs, that's for the emission, that's for the warming, that goes together. So if you, for instance, meet all the SDGs, you're very likely to meet the emission goals, and then you are on the path to 1.5 degrees. When you do not meet the SDGs, but you go to net zero emissions, you're also very likely to make it. But of course, if you don't make the SDGs and not really cut emissions, it will be more difficult. It shows that there are different pathways, but that they are also related, and it is useful to start at one end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Diana is now going to join me, and we're actually going to open the floor for a couple of your questions. If anyone already has a question to ask, I can get the microphone to you. While bear in mind, of course, that Diana is a scientist and she's not an expert in disaster risk reduction. She's here to tell you where we're going and the picture that's painted in the future. While you're thinking about questions, okay, there's a gentleman over there. Can we get a microphone to him, please? I'll come to you in a second. Diana, I was talking about those storms earlier on that we saw in Italy. Under 1.5 degrees, are we still going to be seeing more of them? And also, what about things like forest fires, which we're starting to see increasing?
Okay, now. Yeah, with storms, the thing is, yes, they will be increasing, and they will also on a very steep curve. They will increasing. This is because there's just more energy in the atmosphere. There is more energy in the whole system. Winds are compensatory mechanisms from low to higher regions of pressure, mostly from the tropics to the higher latitudes. And with higher temperatures, generally, average temperatures, there is more energy in the system, so these winds will be stronger. With fires, it's even a bit more, let's say, alarming, because fires are a natural phenomenon, very natural, even if humans wouldn't be on Earth. Yeah, very natural. Exist every year all over the globe, but when they will become more frequent, and when they become more frequent, they release carbon that is previously stored in natural systems and in bioorganic matter. And when that is released, it drives the warming circle. And actually not very recent studies, already 2009, colleagues calculated that is a very strong driving force. So then it will be a vicious circle. And the fires that we have seen this year were actually emitting large amount of carbons, and that is really getting a factor in the system that needs to be factored in, which is often a little bit, let's say, not that present in our understanding. At least for me as a climate impact scientist, I more think about, it gets warmer, so more fires, but that there is this return cycle back to more fires even that is often not seen. So this is getting into a vicious circle there. Yeah.
So in fact, work on preventing forest fires
Yeah.
is actually
Yeah.
fundamental, not just for loss
Yeah.
of life and loss of trees, but also to not feed into the global warming that we're seeing.
Exactly. So maybe, on multiple fronts, thinking about different management strategies. Yeah, also there's a lot of talk about controlled fires now. So really having a fire every couple of years, not to have a large fire every 10 years or so that there's less material. Yeah, we need to think about new management strategies and in general try to meet the 1.5 degree target. Yeah.
Okay, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Anton Mikale from the Council of Europa Major Hazards Agreement. I'm not quite sure how to say this, but given the effort we've put into it so far, given that there's still people or leaders of large countries still denying climate change, do you really think that trying to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees is really possible? And I say this not to be alarmist. My concern is that the current approach that we're taking is not yielding the results that we need to see. The results can only be achieved by policy makers. They can be achieved there, but I think the whole impetus needs to become driven at a much lower level. People who are going to tell the governments what they want. And it's dangerous because you could really become alarmist and you could really alarm people.
Yeah.
But I think given what you are describing, it is time, because I teach at university, and I've always maintained that, for example, sea level rise scenarios are hugely conservative. And now, all of a sudden, we're seeing that reality is much worse than we were thinking. 2 degrees, not enough. We've got to stay at 1.5. And I'm wondering whether it's time to really wake people up to try and ensure that policymakers make the changes that need to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just a quick response. I need to believe in it, otherwise I cannot work in that field anymore. So, and apart from that, I shouldn't talk about belief. I can also just inform you, yeah. I thank you for the note to policymakers. Because I see too often that there are still vested interests in the policy scene. Even if policymakers would believe in a private sense, they have some, they have to care about the job market, and they are in discussions with large industries, and then there are vested interests. So apart from the fact that probably the only way how to increase the pressure and make politicians move is from the bottom up, I think on the higher level that is actually something where we also need to tackle, or where we also need to see and how we can change the vested interest of politicians. And then there was one more thought I had. And then I do think that with the 1.5 degree report and all the media that was around it, that it also now had another level of awareness raising. So our university, for instance, we are now really starting to look into the operations of the university, whether we can change something there. Maybe more institutions can do that. We often do not talk about industry. Industry also needs to do its share. Yeah? And for me, having seen the media around the 1.5 degree report and see what other small institutions do, has increased the hope a little bit again. But yes, it remains extremely difficult. Yeah. Maybe everyone can go home and think about what could be done in their own institution. Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid we do have 2 questions there, but we're going to have to move on because we now have a panel debate. Please will you come and catch Diana afterwards, okay? 'Cause she will be around, so please do come and catch her. I apologise for that. Thank you very much indeed, Diana. That was, yes, a bit of a wake-up call. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call our panellists for our panel debate up onto the stage. Don't forget, as they're coming up and making themselves comfortable, you can send questions to them via the Pigeonhole Live system. And if you're still in bird mode, you can tweet. And so I'm now being joined by 5 panelists. I'm going to introduce them from my right. We have Elisabetta Gardini, who's an Italian member of the European Parliament, representing Forza Italia in the European People's Party grouping. She was the Parliament's rapporteur on the civil protection mechanism, and so, of course, she's closely acquainted with European action in this sphere, and she'll be speaking in Italian. John O'Neill is Head of Adaptation Division at the Department of Climate Change and Environment in Ireland. He's leading climate adaptation policy and implementing the legislation to enable Ireland to become climate resilient in the future, working closely with national, regional and local government. To my left, Nina Birkeland is Senior Advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council, with specific expertise in disaster, displacement and climate change. She's worked on forced migration issues since the 1990s in academia and for NGOs. She also has wide-ranging field experience from Angola and Burundi to Syria and Uganda. Next to her, we have Carlo Cacciamani, who is head of the Centro Funzionale Centrale of Italy's National Department of Civil Protection. He's a meteorologist, I can never say that word, really far too hard, and a climatologist, much easier, with more than 30 years' experience in these areas, and he's also an expert in early warning systems. And finally, on the end, we have Bérangère Basin, who's head of the Flood and Coastal Risk Unit in the Directorate General for Risk Prevention in the French Ministry for an Ecological and Inclusive Transition. She's contributed to a paper on integration of risk and resilience into policy and written articles about France's national policy for flood risk management. And she's also going to be talking to us a bit about how France is actively engaging with the insurance community, which is something that I know has come up already quite a few times, so I think you'll be interested to hear about that. Please give our panellists a warm welcome. I'm going to start off with a very easy question for you all, which is I'd like to hear your reaction to what you just heard from Diana, and in the light of what we heard, how you think we should be addressing resilience from your point of view. I'd like to start with you, Elisabetta. Elisabetta?
Va bene, grazie, thank you. I'll speak.
Well, I am rapporteur of the civil protection. I've been working in at the European Parliament since 2008 in the Environment Committee. So these topics are extremely familiar to me. I followed all the COP since Copenhagen to Paris. I believe that the message the message was conveyed, and it was quite clear for citizens in my country. we should carry on, of course. But in my country, Italy, there is a high percentage, 37% of Italians declares they are alarmed by the problem of climate change. The awareness has been raised, especially among youths. A few days ago, during a ceremony at the European Parliament in Brussels, where we celebrated 70 years of the Declaration of Human Rights, there were some brochures, and among the several pieces of data that were contained in it, there was one piece of data that struck me most. Among children, the main sources of concerns are: the first one is violence, and the second one is climate change. Among children, I believe that this piece of data speaks volumes. I believe that we as politicians, that of course you talked to politicians as well, and we must really respond tangibly to these topics. We must tackle them. I believe that the debate among policymakers about how much climate change depends on human activity or not, I believe that this is a waste of time. We should just leave this topic. Scientists should research on this. What is important is that we have this climate change. Climate change exists. Such intense weather phenomena are here. We experience such phenomena. They cause casualties, they cause economic losses, huge economic losses, and our main concern must be, of course, human lives, but we must also think about the loss of cultural heritage, for example. The loss of what is a main feature of our population, which is our cultural heritage, our artistic heritage. So we must really adapt to climate change. We must give responses. This should be our main source of concern, and we must really make an effort in this and be committed. I believe that this debate about the percentages of how who is to blame for climate change basically is useless and pointless. But we must bear in mind many other things. Let's think about forest fires, for example, that occur, and many more will come. As CO2 is a phenomenon that does not have an impact where it is produced, but everywhere. It has a global impact for all the planet, for all the atmosphere. I think we should focus more on preventing, on extinguishing such fires, because I read some data by this Regional Center for Atmospheric Research and supported by the University of California. They say that the CO2 produced by these forest fires is half of the CO2 produced by the use of all fossil fuels. From industrial and private use, plus all the emissions caused by the use of vehicles. So we should commit more in this sense. I think we should make a higher effort. When we are for policymakers, we must take into account many different things. At the same time, we must tackle these problems, but at the same time we must protect the interest of our entrepreneurs, because these are, of course, jobs we're talking about.
We will be going further into particularly about children, education, awareness raising, also economic losses, getting everybody involved, including companies. I think that's all part of the resilience. John O'Neill, Ireland. What did you think about what you heard from Diana, and how do you think that's going to affect what you're doing?
Sure. Thank you, Aminda, and good afternoon, everybody. I suppose I should own up and say I haven't read all 780 pages of the IPC report, but I've read an awful lot of the report, and I think kind of for me there's 2 or 3 really key messages, maybe kind of even possibly more than that, to come out of it. I suppose the key one, the first one, is that kind of an awful lot has to go right within our overall story, and very little, if anything, can go wrong in terms of kind of trying to achieve 1.5. So I suppose in that respect, the challenge is quite immense in terms of what we're looking at. And that doesn't, as Diana said, going to get into the really difficult challenges about kind of what happens beyond 2 degrees and kind of what would be kind of required in that instance in terms of kind of how we adapt to that level of climate change. But I'll touch on a couple of points that were made maybe kind of earlier and one or two from the floor. I think kind of in terms of how we address this, I think I heard a couple of things before in terms of partnership and collaboration, bottom up in terms of kind of how we can kind of deal with this. Because either way, whether we're looking at 1.5, 2 or beyond 2, we're looking at a transformation in terms of how we actually try and address this. And I think with a transformation, it can't be top down. And I think kind of it has to be kind of, I suppose, kind of whole of society in terms of how we deal with this. It's not just government, it's the communities, it's the private sector, it's communities kind of, I suppose, who are already kind of working in different kind of areas. And it's kind of everybody, I suppose, kind of in terms of kind of trying to address the issues that we have, not just in terms of, I suppose, the climate mitigation side, but actually how we make those really difficult decisions about kind of what sort of future we want to inhabit, not just for ourselves, but for our children, in terms of kind of what we would see as the acceptable kind of level of risk that we're willing to all kind of live with.
Okay, thank you. Nina, one thing we've not touched on, which of course is going to become huge, is climate change, migration and displacement. What's your reaction to what you heard from Diana, and what do you think, how is that going to impact on your work?
I think, first of all, I want to congratulate Diana and her colleagues for this report, because it's the first time we really see the difference between 2 and 1.5 degrees. Paris, just a few years back, everyone was like, oh, let's try to reach 2 degrees. And now we really see it's a huge difference between the two. And I think the push from small island states and a few others to really put the target at 1.5 is important. If you look at people at the risk of being displaced, not just moving because they want to, but they don't have a choice, these figures are already very high. We, as the Norwegian Refugee Council, through our office called Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, we have been looking at this for 10 years now. And we've seen that on average, every year since 2008, there's been 2, 3, 4 times as many people displaced by disasters, weather-related disasters, as by conflict and violence. We also know that with the work we've done, we've seen this in almost every country in the world. 185 countries, we've seen disaster displacement. So this is happening. I also think what we really have now, and thanks to a lot of the knowledge coming out, is that we have a unique opportunity to act and not just sit and say, oh, this is too much. Because if we look at disaster displacement, we know where it's happening, we know where the risks are highest, so we can also start to do concrete actions to both prevent and mitigate. We still also have to work very much on trying to reduce the emissions, but no matter how good we are, the climate is changing. If you look to our region, Europe, if you look at figures, luckily the figures are relatively low globally. But this is also linked to that there is relatively good systems in place to respond when a disaster happens, but also in prevention. But still, if you go back to last year, in France, we have colleagues from there. France had more than 20,000 people being displaced inside France, linked to natural disasters. So this is also happening here. I think what we really need to look at is that we can do something. We need, with this group we are in this room, how do we include prevention and response to displacement in national DRR strategies? So how do we get that in there? We have seen in countries that have been able to do this, that you get the number down. But also I think we need to look at the other side of the coin and sometimes say, oh, but the displacement figures are too big. We also have to relate that to the fact that the number of people being killed in disasters is going down. So in some ways, if you are able to flee and run away, it's still better than die from it. So some of the success is less death and more displacement So now we need to work more on the displacement. How can we also reduce that and hopefully prevent it?
Okay, thank you. Carlo, from Italy's point of view, we obviously had a special focus on a little bit on the Mediterranean, but what's your reaction to what you heard? And what does it mean for planning for resilience in Italy?
Well, for sure, the Mediterranean area is a hotspot, as you said, from the climate change point of view. It is one of the areas of the world where we have less uncertainty from the point of view of models in mocking climate scenarios. Of course, the idea that we can have a hotter future is already widely known. There is a huge difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, which is a bit shocking, as our colleague was saying before, especially in areas of medium latitudes, which is exactly our case of Europe. Another important aspect that I don't know if it was stressed before is the increase of the risk of flash floods, because a hotter atmosphere is much more unstable, so it can provoke intense phenomena, huge rainfalls that occur in very short times. We're experiencing it in our country, an increase in the intense phenomena, where in just a few hours we have an amount of rainfall which is a fifth of what happens in the entire year. So this is extremely difficult to mitigate. One thing I would like to stress is that the risk conditions are given by an increase of the hazard determined by by climate change, and by the fact that this extreme phenomena, this dangerous phenomena, have an impact on very vulnerable areas which are extremely exposed to risk. Just let's remember that risk is the composition of these three elements. In order to reduce risk, that from a certain point of view, the reduction of risk, as the Environment Agency has recently tested in one of the latest reports, goes in preventing this climate change. We must really reduce vulnerability, reduce the exposure, reduce the causes of climate change. We must really work on mitigation in order to reduce the causes, but at the same time we should work on adapting to reduce the exposure to risk. As Italian Civil Protection, we really work in this sense, because with the early warning system we really try to help populations prevent risk. We try to warn them as soon as possible, where it is possible, of course. For some phenomena we can do that, for some others we cannot, unfortunately. At some points we warn for flash floods, for example, and it is more difficult in that case because we have more uncertainty. So there is all handling of this early warning that must be optimized in order to take into account the fact that the most dangerous phenomena are not the phenomena that last 2 or 3 days, but the phenomena that occur in half an hour, 1 hour, and can provoke losses and casualties. We can go into detail later.
I want to be talking to you, particularly since you're an expert in early warning systems, about how we can improve those to even cover these very events that happen incredibly quickly. But we'll talk about that in a moment. I want to hear, Bérangère, your reaction to what you heard. And you're also very concentrated on flood risk and the water side of the risks that we face. So again, you probably want to maybe even react to what Carlo had to say as well.
Yes, thank you, Aminda. Good afternoon, everybody. So first reaction, thank you to Diana for presenting this very interesting and well-known report. First reaction, of course, this report, well, confirms the trends, but so it shows the most optimistic scenario, the 1.5, but yet the impacts, even with 1.5, are very significant. And that's really, for me, one of the key messages. And of course, that urges us to work on mitigation, but also on adaptation, which is sometimes like the poor parent, but that really points towards adaptation as well. And as my colleague or my neighbor already noticed, you said Mediterranean region will be a climate change hotspot. And that's also a very interesting message, with more storms, heat extremes and less precipitation, and that has to be taken into consideration. Also, as Aminda said, I work on the water side, so on floods, and fluvial floods worldwide, you said, would be plus 100%, with 1.5 and plus 170% population affected with 2 degrees, and that's a huge difference. So working on DRR for us is really a building block of adaptation, and that's for me a very important message. It is adaptation. It fully participates into adaptation. Everything we do under risk prevention does participate to adaptation. I think I will stop here for now.
Okay, well, in fact, yeah, perhaps not, because I want to ask you a question about how France is working together with the insurance industry, because you've got a dedicated fund for risk prevention, and that part of that comes from money that, you tell everyone.
Yes, indeed. In France, we have a dedicated mechanism to compensate the economic damage when there are disasters. And this special compensation mechanism is based on national solidarity. And I think it's quite unique, or so it works, the way it works is that everybody in France pays a home insurance contract, and for those who have cars, a car insurance. And basically 12% of what everybody pays on his or her insurance contract is collected by the insurance companies to feed a fund to compensate people in case of disasters. And if there is a disaster which is higher or with losses that are higher than the money, the amount of money, then the French state comes into guarantee. Based on that, we also have a dedicated fund for risk prevention. And so I said 12% of what you pay on your insurance contract goes for this compensation scheme. And then again, 12% of that is taken out to feed the prevention fund. So it's 12% of 12%. But then this prevention fund is one of our very important tool to make prevention go forward. That really enables us to co-finance many risk prevention projects.
Elisabetta, do you think that's perhaps an idea that we could try and move something or investigate on a European level?
Mi sembra uno spunto.
Well, I believe that is a very interesting input, and also a very quite delicate, sensitive issue, a sensitive topic. Because, of course, the situations in all the European countries are different, so perhaps we may find something more flexible that can be adapted to the several realities. For example, in my country, Italy, the President of the Senate, following those events over the last months, meaning trees that have been destroyed by these strong winds in my region, Trentino Alto Adige, and in several areas, 60% of trees have been have been taken down. So think about also this in terms of heritage, eradicated trees. We had a commission that studied the situation in Italy in terms of hydrogeological risk and also other kinds of risk. In Italy, 91% of municipalities are considered at risk. So you can see that when we think about these numbers, these figures, the issue of insurance is something that concerns many people because it has a cost that has to be balanced between among all the municipalities. But I was very interested in what the Italian colleague said. We have a great experience in Italy, unfortunately, for these events. I believe that we must act on adaptation. We must do something about adaptation. Maybe we have pushed too much mitigation and we have left aside the adaptation. And I believe that these two things must really go one next to the other, hand in hand, because thanks to the Paris Agreement, really, we must do something to reach the aims that have been set. So if mitigation is slow, we must find a balance with the adaptation. For example, we are trying to strengthen Protezione Civile, civil protection in Europe, because last summer, to 2017, we've seen the devastating fires in Portugal with almost 100 people lost their lives, but also in Greece this summer was something similar. But then this extended to countries that have never experienced such realities in terms of forest fires. We've had Sweden, which had 80 more fires respect to the previous years. Norway, even though Norway is not in the EU, is the European continent. So we've had Germany as well. So you know all about this. You know these events that occurred. So we are trying really to strengthen the mechanism of civil protection in Europe. Also, following the experience of Japan, Japan was the most prepared country, but in the end, it wasn't prepared for the Fukushima disaster. So we really need, following this example, we really need to do our best in terms of prevention. Prevention must be our obsession, in a sense. I remember that the previous commissioner, Kristalina Georgieva, said, unfortunately, for many countries, prevention is not appealing, it's not sexy, so they were quite reluctant in investing. Well, I believe that this reluctancy has disappeared because citizens need to have prevention, because otherwise they will find themselves in catastrophes and they don't know what to do. So our commitment right now is the best prevention and then response. I would also like to say that we need that the United Nations, this becomes a global issue also in the United Nations. We are doing our best as Europe, but maybe Europe is asking too much to their businesses and companies, because this is really a global issue. This is a global issue, so we must discuss this also in the United Nations. If China promises something, but then we see that they don't keep their promises, we should do something. So this is a discussion that needs to be dealt with. We should have sanctions for countries, for big countries who do not want to contribute in this. We are all in this together, so either we are all aligned in this, otherwise it would be a problem, because Europe is emitting less than 10% of CO2, but we pay the price also of what the other countries outside Europe emit. So I really believe that the United Nations must act, must make an effort in this sense.
Message here. Okay, we're going to come to questions from the floor in a minute. Can we get a microphone to that lady over there? And there's a gentleman over here that you wanted to ask a question yesterday. Do you still want to ask your question today? Can we get a microphone to him as well, please? So the lady over there and the gentleman over here. I'll come to your questions in a moment. John, in Ireland, what are you doing? And there was a question here for you. How does Ireland integrate climate change and disaster risk reduction? I also wanted to ask you what type of things are you experiencing? What type of problems, and how you're learning from them for resilience in the future?
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of what we're doing currently, in terms of integrating, it's an ongoing process. It's probably kind of, I think, would reflect kind of challenges that are in other jurisdictions and across the EU in terms of how we kind of, I suppose, kind of make sure that we are integrated across the two communities, because we are both trying to kind of achieve the same objective. What we're doing is kind of, we're having a very strong focus on kind of the local and kind of regional response, who have that responsibility as one of the key kind of bodies who deal with the disaster risk in terms of emergency planning and so forth. So what we're trying to do then is actually kind of put a climate change lens on that kind of work. And I think one of the key challenges here is kind of how we address the short term and the long term. So I think kind of there's always a kind of a very strong focus on kind of disaster risk and kind of what might happen in the next year or two. But it's trying to kind of, I suppose, kind of trying to look beyond that, and how do we ensure that we're actually kind of climate resilient, not just next year and the year after in terms of our response, but that we're climate resilient 10, 20 years down the line in terms of what we're kind of looking at kind of currently. So I think it's a kind of it's an ongoing challenge. As I said, I think kind of from our point of view, the key is getting the local people who are actually kind of, I suppose, on the ground, who are the first responders to emergency planning, and for them to kind of take that kind of much longer term view then in terms of what's happening on the climate action side of things.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the two questions that the people that have got microphones from the floor, and then we're going to take some questions. There's various questions for specific panelists coming up on Pigeonhole as well. Would you like to give us your question, please?
I'm Giampiero Griffo per European Disability Forum. Credo che il tema di cui parliamo oggi si debba
I believe that the topic we are dealing with today must really intersect with the SDGs. There are many responsibilities in terms of economy, in terms of climate and developments, also changes in lifestyles and poverty. These are all part of one system. So I believe that the coordination within the states and above the states need to make an effort. I'll make an example. The World Health Organization said that the shift of some diseases from some areas, subtropical areas, is occurring. So they are shifting to other areas. So there is a problem here, not only an economic problem, but we also need to prevent those diseases, to have structures that can cure such diseases. And I think this is really important, because the result in the end is that the population has an impact, is affected. So I believe that we must really resonate between all the competent authorities that in the past have worked separately, but right now it's compulsory for them to work together. So my question is, what is happening? Is there a bigger coordination? Is there a bigger awareness of cooperations between different levels of governments, environmentalists, economists, whoever is dealing with climate change? Of course, I am speaking on behalf of a group which is most affected, people with disability. So my interest is understanding how the policies are adapting to these new strategies, these new challenges.
Before we answer that question, I'm going to the lady with the microphone. We should have sent you a microphone over there. You put your hand up. You've disappeared? No, there you are. Have you got the microphone? No. Can someone please send a microphone to that lady sitting in the middle? It's coming. You're going to get two. One from either side.
It's okay. I think this works.
Please keep your question short because we've got a lot of...
Well, mine is not really a question. My name is Chiara Mellucci and I work, or I'm shortly going on a sabbatical, but for the United Nations Development Program. And I wanted to thank you, Elisabetta Gardini, for bringing in names from the European Union, the World Bank, and the United Nations. At the global level, there is a lot that's being discussed already on this exactly same thematics. And I must say that my experience comes from working in developing countries and other international forums. And I feel a bit surprised somehow on the type of discussions we are having here in this very European forum, because it makes me think that there is so much also to learn from global forum, and I guess it shouldn't be my task, but rather colleagues from EFDRR, to invite everyone to attend the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction next May in Geneva, where you will hear much more of this and what's happening worldwide. But my point, excuse me for being long, it's also about the United Nations and our role. I mean, all these agreements are not binding. Sendai is not binding. The US have gone out of Paris. I think we should really bring this into perspective in terms of the role as the United Nations, in terms of the advocacy, UNSDR and others programs. So the governments have a major role, whether it's Europe or other continents, to really make all these agreements work and to really be the drivers of risk reduction.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. So I'd like to get your reaction and your answers to the question that we heard about, are we doing enough all working together? And Carlo, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to also ask the question that's on here, which is very popular, about the role of the, oh dear, why does it always have to be meteorological, hydrological and climate services play or should play for boosting resilience? So there, that links into your work.
Okay. Cosiddetti climate.
Well, climate services are fundamental. Also, in terms of boosting resilience, this is, I have an example of this in civil protection in Italy. For example, the weather forecast systems, very detailed forecasts that are a requirement in order to know the hazard conditions that are present on different territories. But if we want to extend this to the adaptation measures in terms of agriculture, for example, or all the practices that can be typical, such as irrigation, and how they can, what benefits they can have from climate services that can let them know before what is the water need of that land in order to optimize the water supply. We've seen in the keynote that one of the problems that in the Mediterranean area is water resources. So it's probably the main problem. Water and water scarcity is indeed a big issue. Water sources are going down because there is less quantity of water actually, but there is a bigger need for this resource. But also in the Mediterranean, we do have less water, but on the other hand, when it rains a lot, so we get floods. So this is a problem for us. As climate services, we can think about the optimization of energetic services, how useful the weather system and weather forecasts are to gas storage or any kind of energy storage, and in terms of productions or consumption. We've heard a lot about heat waves, and let's think about how useful it is to build climate services that allow to have a alarm for the heatwave conditions. This is something that is already operative at a national level. That it involves many actors and many sectors, many knowledge. We have the technological, scientific knowledge for these alarm services. We've got the health knowledge, the health system, social assistance. This is also a topic that can be also discussed. In the previous session, I heard about this this need to extend the borders, to have a cross-border approach. We, for example, have the urgent need to improve alarm systems, but we also need to be able to communicate these alarms well. So here also the communication issue is very, very relevant for the population. We also need to train citizens to make them active when it comes to safety, to their safety and security. So we've got a lot of skills here that can be joined, and in these activities, adaptation activities, we must do a brainstorming of these skills and knowledge in order to reach our targets, because an engineer or a meteorologist or climatologist cannot do this on their own. They need to communicate together with those dealing with training in schools. This is very important. And then we have the bigger issue of communication. We've said that climate change can change risk conditions, for example, flood risks. So we really need to be punctual. We've got half an hour to alert a city. So we need this target to reach. For example, this is possible through new technologies. So really to create systems, intersectorial systems that allow us to be punctual, not forgetting that citizens are human beings. So we need to support them also from a psychological point of view, because it's easy to say, tomorrow we've got an Indiana Jones movie coming up, and it's really difficult instead to say, tomorrow there's going to be a flood and you may die tomorrow. So we need to be able to communicate better to people. So we really need to join different knowledge and skills. We have many skills, but this actually can take a whole seminar to discuss this, so I will stop.
At this moment. We are going to go on a little bit longer because we started a bit late. So I'm just going to be running a little bit over, probably no more than 10 minutes, because I do want to get to some of these questions that are coming up. But Bérangère, I know that in France you've been doing some interesting communication campaigns. Could you tell us a little bit about those, just to give us an example of what type of things you're doing?
Indeed, I can. For instance, we've launched 3 years ago a communication campaign about intense rainfall events and flash floods, as Carlo was mentioning, the flash floods. That's a media campaign, so it's on TV, on radio. Also, we reached schools, and basically with key behaviors to adopt when such a Mediterranean event occurs. Very basic behavioral recommendations like do not go to school to pick up your children. They are safe at school. It will be much more dangerous for you to be on the road in your car. So don't go and don't pick up your children. So those kind of messages. And so we've been running this communication campaign for 3 years now, and starting this summer, we've also launched a communication campaign on forest fire with again, behavioral recommendations regarding forest fire, because as Elisabetta mentioned, I mean, forest fire risk will expand and the area which is exposed will really become larger. So that's why we decided to launch such a campaign. And speaking about forest fire, in the reflections that we are currently having on our second national adaptation plan, we really do focus on this emerging risk of forest fire, and we are really thinking about like new or different tree species that are less vulnerable to forest fire that we should plant now in order that they have time to grow and be big when the risk will be much higher. So that's a kind of a focus of our, or one example of our reflections in the preparation of our second national adaptation plan that should be adopted very soon. And if I may, I also want to give you another concrete example, because the question had been asked to John, how does Ireland integrate climate change and DRR? So if I may give a French example on that as well. So it's around urban planning in coastal areas, because of course urban planning is key for adaptation, and if you don't build in areas which are exposed to flooding, it's much better. And what we've done since 2011, when we draw the maps, the risk maps, which will be then used in urban planning to decide where to build and where not to build. So since a couple of years now, we are already introducing in the risk maps sea level rise. So basically then urban planning decisions do take into account the sea level rise. But it is very difficult the acceptation of that is quite difficult at local level, and so a lot of work has to be done with local authorities especially to make those decisions understandable and acceptable. But so that was a very concrete example around urban planning along the coast.
Thank you. And I know you also mentioned to me things like the insurance industry input into urban planning, so that after floods, the electricity, all the sockets are put higher up in the houses. Things like making sure that people who are at risk of flooding also have like access to the roof, things like that, which are very concrete. Just, Nina, you have a very different perspective on all of this, and I get the feeling that your side, if all the other communities aren't talking, you're certainly not being included in these discussions. What can happen to bring the displacement issue higher up the agenda? Because of course it's such a political football and hot potato at the moment.
I think first of all what is important is that we talk together across the different sectors. In the meetings yesterday and today, we talked a lot about policy coherence. So we talk about the SDGs, we have the Paris Agreement, we have, of course, Sendai. We have the two other processes that we don't talk about here because I think it's quite political, but it's the Global Compact on Migration, which is actually also addressing how we're going to deal with disaster displacement and the effects of climate change on migration. So I think one of the challenges we have is that within the DR world, if you look at the way response is done, as I tried to say, you can see it's very good in many ways. But often, as you say, we tend to forget that people also have to leave and flee away from their homes. So just to remember that the response will be slightly different. The prevention will be slightly different. We're not talking about changing everything. It's just remember one more group in the planning and the response. I also think what is a challenge is that we want to really try to avoid that people have to flee away. But we also know with disasters, with the effects of climate change, that people can actually move is one of the most effective ways of adaptation. So how can we secure people's right and possibility to move when we also especially in Europe, but also other parts of the world, a very strict way of understanding migration and borders. So how can we deal with this? But in this whole discussion about migration and displacement, I think we really need to remember that almost everyone who flees from a disaster, they stay within their own countries. It's only a small number of people that actually cross borders. So don't make this into something that it isn't. We can deal with it, and we are dealing with it, but we need to think of it. And this is, again, what I tried to say in the beginning. In the first commitments around Target E, remember to put disaster displacement in. Then there's one step, and then we need to work across the sectors.
Do you think we need to be stress testing our systems? Because Europe saw, well, what for Europe thought was large migration in 2015, though we heard earlier on that was very minor. But our system couldn't cope with that. What happens if we suddenly have many more climate migrants? Do we need to be stress testing our systems?
Absolutely, and I think this is something that's happening in so many other parts of the world, and I think we in Europe often are too afraid to talk about it, so we just push it aside. If you look to Central America, their governments on different sides of the border have come together to try to see what happens if we, for example, have a flood close to the border and people will move inside the country, but also some will cross. How do we react on this? To try to have this plan before it happens and not when it happens. And this can be done without getting stuck in the big politics around migration and refugees. This is about concrete actions, and there's so many examples, and I really think we in Europe can learn a lot from other parts of the world on this.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move towards a conclusion now, but since one question had a huge number of 31 votes, I'm going to put it to the panelists along with my final question as well. The question was, in your countries, how is the budget for DRR in evolving climate allocated? Do you perform comprehensive cost-benefit analyses? And I would also add stress testing on the systems that you have on there. Not everybody can necessarily talk from a national perspective, but also just thinking about, you know, are we getting the proportions of budget allocation correct? Elisabetta.
I have to say that from a European level, the budget is quite small, relatively small, because this is a more national issue. Also in federal system countries, here competences are not even regional as regarding civil protection. So I believe that Europe will have, as we are already doing, will need to allocate funds to help countries to make their territories more resilient. So this is a battle that we are fighting. It is very hard. You know, the European budget, 1% of the budget is, of all countries, is, so it is a very small amount. But on this, also with Commissioner Stylianides, we are trying to make these funds available and that they are allocated on climate. So I have to say that here we are talking with countries because we as Parliament want money on civil protection, funds on civil protection, whereas other countries would like to take this money from other programs. So there is a lot of debate going on around this with national governments. So wish us luck, because we will have to close this chapter soon. I hope that these 2 days have raised the awareness of countries in this sense.
John?
Yeah, I suppose kind of just to say at the outset, I don't work directly with the DRR side of things, but this is quite complex in terms of I suppose the budgets and the funding side of things, because what happens is each sector, whether that's transport or agriculture, would all have their own I suppose risk profile in terms of DRR, and that will come out of a central fund for that particular sector. And then you have at the local, regional level a system where the local government is funded to deal with emergency planning and management. One thing that I would say is that what we're trying to do at the moment is do a lot more work on costing what extreme weather events have been costing kind of Ireland in the last number of years. And it's quite clear that there are significant sums of money involved with this, whether that's fluvial flooding or extreme weather from sea level rise and other issues that we're seeing at the moment. And it's quite clear, I suppose, that kind of earlier action in terms of kind of planning for this, kind of in terms of the near and the kind of longer term, will be a lot more cost effective than actually kind of, I suppose, trying to kind of deal with the cleanup costs and the kind of actions that after the extreme weather.
Okay, Bérangère, you have to go, so give us your last words.
Yeah, sorry, I will have to go in 2 minutes. Just a few words on this question. So basically, from our side, we are really fighting to keep our prevention fund, and so it's around 170 million expenses a year. So, and that's a way of tackling it. I mean, really making sure that we keep this prevention fund.
Thank you. Carlo?
I cannot give you a number on this, I'm sorry. What I can say is that during the last events, we had the latest events of Italy, in order to talk about cost damage, we had 700-800 million euros damages and economic losses in only one event. So what I can say, without knowing the budget, is that the cost of prevention is lower for sure. So if we look at it from a cost-benefit point of view, prevention compared to the cost of damages is extremely lower. So we should really invest much more on prevention actions and protection actions as well. So we should maintain the systems and make sure that they work as at their best. The civil protection system is just one example, but this is true also for other sectors. The cost-benefit analysis for many risk analysis, we show that prevention is really cheaper than the repair after the disasters. Of course, if we have damages, we must really tackle and solve these problems. So for people it is clearer, while for prevention people tend to think that it is money badly spent, because you think that yes, you put money on prevention but you're not sure if these disasters will occur or not, so they think they are losing their money, but it is not true. It is a very important investment we should make, especially for the future when these damages will be huge.
Obviously this, I think the cost-benefit analysis, given that there aren't even perhaps figures being collected for the amount of migration we're talking about for climate change, getting to this level of cost-benefit analysis is perhaps a little bit in the future, I don't know.
No, I think globally I can't give you a figure, but what we have seen is that when you look at specific situations in the humanitarian world, if you use $1 or euro, whatever currency you use, in prevention, you would save at least 7 in response. And in the small island states of Tuvalu, they bought land in Fiji to move their people because of the climate change. And to move one family of 5 costed more than $50,000. So yes, it's a big sum, but if you think of what would happen if you didn't move them and it was planned, the cost, one thing is the financial cost, but you also, of course, have the non-economic loss, which we don't put in money, but how it is affecting us as people.
The psychological factor, yeah. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've also lost 2 pieces of our panel. So I think it's time to draw this all to a conclusion. As you probably know, the Rome Declaration of Stakeholders is due to be adopted at the end of this forum in a short while. Among other things, it calls for governments and stakeholders to explore innovative decision-making support tools to help stress test current systems against realistic climate impact scenarios. This afternoon, we've heard a little bit of some ideas ideas of how we can move forward and how we can test our systems. And I hope you'll be inspired by what you've heard and develop them with your colleagues when you go back after this forum. There's now going to be probably a 20-minute break until round about 4 p.m. when the EFDRR closing ceremony will be taking place in the auditorium here. Before you all rush off, of course, we need to do some thank yous. I'd like to thank our keynote speaker and all our panelists, including the two who've had to go, for sharing their expert knowledge and their invaluable insights. Thank you to the interpreters, the technicians, the people who are doing the cameras and looking after our microphones, and the staff from the UNISDR monitoring, who were monitoring Pigeonhole for us. Thanks to the organisers behind this session, led by the University of Helsinki and the Euro-Mediterranean Centre on Climate Change, along with many others, in conjunction with the UNISDR. And of course, thanks to the organisers of the entire conference, the Italian chairmanship of the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Italian Civil Protection Department's presidency of the Council of Ministers, the European Commission, the Euro-OPA Major Hazards Agreement of the Council of Europe, and of course, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, both here in the room and those of you watching online, for your active involvement and lots of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get them all in, but it's always good to have a choice. And I think we should conclude this plenary with a big round of applause for everyone.